Hello, everybody. It's been a while. For me, not for you. I haven't recorded a video in like a month and a half, maybe. But I'm back. So, hello. Today, I wanted to talk about the Odyssey. But before I get into that, I wanted to direct you to an amazing ASMR YouTube channel called Growl ASMR. Growl is a phenomenal channel and a wonderful guy by all my impressions. He does really wonderful work in his own life, and he is super deserving of your support. So, please stop watching this video. Go type Growl ASMR into the search bar. Actually, better yet, I will pin his channel in the comments, and I'll leave it in the description. So please go there, subscribe to him. He was just on hiatus for a bit, but he's back now, and I think you'll absolutely love the videos that he makes. I certainly do. But with that being said, let's jump into today's video topic, which is that I watched the Odyssey last week, which is Christopher Nolan's new movie. And Christopher Nolan is, to some extent, one of the last directors of, I don't know, an age when famous directors really could almost guarantee the success of a movie. These sort of legendary names, Spielberg, Scorsese, Nolan, and so on, right? James Cameron. Many of them are, getting older now. And this is just a random ramble, but it feels a little bit like they're not being replaced, There's wonderful directors out there. Bong Joon-ho, Greta Gerwig, Denis Villeneuve, tons of amazing directors. But I don't feel like there's the same, gravitational force to them, if that makes sense, to their names. Anyway, that's neither here nor there, just a random little rumination. But onto the topic of the Odyssey. I should say I like Christopher Nolan's movies. The only one that I ever actively didn't like was Tenet. But even that was not, a horrible movie. I just didn't really care for it for a variety of reasons. But Nolan's movies are always good. They have a certain baseline of good. And some of them I like quite a lot. I think Inception is phenomenal. But his movies also never, strike the chords of my soul, None of Nolan's movies are in my favorites. just a personal stylistic thing. Many of my friends love Nolan's movies, and they would have, The Dark Knight Rises, the Batman movies, Inception, whatever is some of their favorite movies. Nolan also has a certain style. I tend to think of him as this, almost modern Gothic. This sort of lush, grand stories with these, currents of darkness through them, and the darkness of human character, human behavior, not in a sort of monstrously, sadistically, voyeuristic way, right? Not in this, we're going to plumb the depths of human depravity, but, as I said, kind of in a gothic way, sort of a high emotion, high opera sort of sense in his films. Anyway, that's this sort of a general notion that I have of Nolan from his movies. And they also tend to be very gritty, right, realistic, sort of down to earth at the same time that they are grand in scale. So in many ways, his take on the Odyssey really didn't surprise me, because he dropped it very heavily into a realistic world. It doesn't surprise me that he used this kind of American English speech and dialect for the characters. And, I guess we should just jump into it. Okay, before we dive in, I think it would be, almost dishonest to not address the controversy around this movie. It has been talked about endlessly for months now. I don't really want to get into it. I want to talk about the movie on its own merits and about, its themes and choices and so on. This kind of, culture war, politics stuff, I don't want to talk about it. I'm so exhausted by that conversation. People have been yelling about this movie for months. Nobody had seen it. And I understand you don't have to see every piece of art, fully to critique it, and people had seen trailers and this and that, whatever. The point is, I was just sick to death of how much discourse there was about this movie. I was so bored by people yelling about something that they hadn't even seen. So, anyway, I don't want to get into all that. I'm not interested in debating the politics of casting choices and this or that. I'm just going to take the movie as it is. Yeah. So, I'll just start high level, and then we can kind of talk about the movie's choices and specifics. I liked the movie, but it is at the bottom of my Nolan tier list, except for Tenet. So, as I mentioned, I actively do not really like Tenet. This movie I did not actively dislike. I did enjoy it, but I thought it was pretty heavily flawed in some respects. But it did off something, impressive, which is that I sat there for almost 3 hours in the theater, and I was never bored. It held my interest, so it's at the very least, I found it entertaining. To start with, just jumping into some of the topics that I've been thinking about with this movie, and I'll bounce around from, positive things to negative things to whatever. I don't have a script or an outline for this, so it'll be kind of freewheeling. You know what? Let's talk about the American speech of the actors, because I mentioned that earlier. So we live in a culture where elevated language, kind of harkening back to like the King James Bible, that kind of elevated language has associations with antiquity, old noble stories. There's an element of British accent that plays into that. And this is from my kind of American context, Nolan is British, so I am sure the connotations are tweaked differently, but I think I understand why he made the choice to do American accents, and why he chose to have the dialogue be so common and modern. So as I was saying, the context that we tend to expect for, an ancient movie is that they're going to talk in a high-mannered way because of this whole constellation of things about, this ancient poetry, this Homeric text is very revered. It is, something like the Iliad is as iconic in the English language corpus as the Bible is, right? These are foundational texts when we talk about the classics, right? When we talk about sort of classical literature education, nobody is missing out on Homer, right? So how do we ascribe a sense of grandiosity to this poetry which we hold in such high regard, which we hold as such a foundational element of our literary tradition? Well, we tend to translate it in this very sumptuous, elegant, shaped text, right? Something that harkens to the Bible, that harkens to elevated speech. Now, I am no expert on Homer, historically, right? It's been a long time since I've read through the Iliad, and seeing the Odyssey, I had actually forgotten many parts of the story, and was kind of being reminded of them as it went. I was like, oh yeah, I forgot about was it Circe and the pigs, right? So, anyway, when we watch an old movie, or a movie set in, antiquity, we have an inbuilt association for that language to be this and this extends to something like, say, the Lord of the Rings movies. We're in this fantastical, historical fantasy world. And in the movies, right, and in the books, I haven't read The Lord of the Rings in years, but I remember one of my strongest impressions when I first read The Lord of the Rings was, wow, this is like if the Bible was fun to read. I had to read a lot of the Bible growing up, and it's not the most interesting text, but reading Tolkien, I just remember thinking, this is so biblical. But yeah, so in Lord of the Rings, they will say stuff like father. They would never say dad in the Lord of the Rings. They would say father, and most translations of the Iliad or the Odyssey would say father, because they are reaching for that heightened language. What Nolan did in this movie was intentionally, purposely use common modern speech. And the reason that he did that is because Homer, from my understanding, is very simple. He was, the poetry is very relatable, very clear. It's not particularly ornate. Now, I wouldn't die on that hill because, as I said, I'm not an expert on Homer. I've only read translations, and that's about the extent of my education on this. But my understanding, what I've heard, is that the Homeric form is a very relatable form. And I think Nolan was going for that flavor with this movie, right? Now, I didn't mind it. I will say, yeah, I got used to the way that they were talking, but every time somebody said dad or mom, I was like, okay, can we just at least say father and mother? It just sounds very strange to me to be in, ancient Ithaca, and Tom Holland is saying, where's my dad? But the language overall didn't bother me, and it served a purpose, so I'll jump to one of my problems with the movie, which was that I thought the writing was pretty functional overall, but sometimes they just had these really shoddy, kind of ham-fisted lines. And I think that's just a little bit of Nolan, perhaps. There's the bit at the end of Oppenheimer where they have the big moment. A young senator is trying to make a name for himself, John F. Kennedy, right? And it's these little Easter eggs or whatever you want to call it that Nolan does. The most egregious. Oh, and by the way, full spoilers for the movie. I'll put that up on screen at the beginning, because I forgot to mention until now. But yeah, full spoilers for the movie, for the Odyssey. I think one of the most egregious examples for me, actually the most egregious in the movie, was when Odysseus is talking to Penelope. He's made it back to Ithaca, and he's in disguise, and he says, "Our age of bronze is collapsing." And it's just such an eye-rolling moment because that's using literally the historical academic term of the Bronze Age collapse and putting it in the Odysseus. And, your mileage may vary, that might not bother you. To me, it makes me want to stick an ice pick somewhere, because it takes me out of the immersion, and suddenly I see Nolan at his writing desk, just writing. He's thinking, oh, this is going to be a great reference to the Bronze Age collapse. The audience is going to love this. And that is not where I want to be in a movie. But anyway, yeah, mostly just the occasional little weird line that threw me for a loop. And now I'll just go to the biggest weakness of the movie for me, which was the Ithaca stuff. I honestly think the movie would have been better if you had just shown the stuff from Odysseus's perspective, which is to say, you have the flashbacks of Ithaca with Odysseus and Penelope, and the drawing lots and all this. And then, the Odyssey adventure, yada yada. And then you get back to Ithaca, and Odysseus has to deal with the suitors, and you learn what's happened. Obviously, that's not how the story goes, but I really found the Ithaca stuff very weak. And I don't want to be too mean, but I just thought Tom Holland was very poorly cast. I think he's a good actor, but this is just not a role for him, in my opinion. I was not compelled at all by what was happening in Ithaca. I didn't think the characters were super interesting. I didn't think that the events and the plot there was very interesting. We have Odysseus having this life-changing character journey, and it's very psychological and traumatic, and it's all these things are going on, and then we cut back to Ithaca, and it's just this cartoonishly evil Robert Pattinson throwing a dog on a dung heap. I don't know, it just didn't work for me. The Ithaca stuff kind of didn't work for me at all. And so, as I said, I didn't really get bored during the movie, but if I was bored, it was at the Ithaca stuff, especially at the beginning. The beginning sequence was a little tough to get through. But yeah, then the fact that I liked the movie overall comes from the fact that I liked the Odysseus plotline quite a bit, and I was actually very skeptical of Matt Damon when I saw the trailers for the movie. I didn't really think that Matt Damon was a good choice for Odysseus, but I thought he performed it very well. I mean, he's not how I imagine Odysseus in my head. If I were making a movie version of the Iliad or the Odyssey, it wouldn't be this, and it wouldn't be Matt Damon, but I actually thought he did quite an interesting job. You know what, maybe I'll just say like a high level thing about art here, which is, I think much of the critique that this movie is getting is coming from a place of, I would have done it differently. And that's not, by the way, I don't care if you didn't like the movie. I kind of didn't like the movie either, in many ways. I respect, whatever, your opinion is fine. that's not how I would have done it. Well, that's not how I would have done it. I would have done historically accurate costumes. Well, that's not how I would have done it. I would have cast it, I would have had all Greek actors. Well, that's not how I would have done it. I would have had the cast speak Greek. I would have had them learn ancient Greek. I would have only used dialogue from the poem, right? This and that thing. And to be clear, that's a fine reason to not like something. If you disagree with their artistic choices, you can say, I don't think that these weird-looking costumes worked. I think they were ugly and didn't serve the movie, thematically or whatever. But what I find a little wrong-headed is when people take the additional step of saying, and that's the wrong way to make a movie. It's the wrong way to make this movie, right? No, this is Christopher Nolan's version of the Odyssey. Every artist has the right and should make their own choices. They should do things the way that they want to do it. Another director would have tried to do a very historically accurate costuming, like, if this story were real, if it actually happened, what would it all have looked like? And that's fine. That sounds like an awesome movie to me. I would probably like that movie better than this one. But when Christopher Nolan says that he's making an Odyssey movie, it's not going to be Ben-Hur, right? And, we should all know that. And if you expect it to be Ben-Hur, I just think you have, I don't know, just a perspective on art that I disagree with. You can dislike, you can hate a piece of art, but I think you need to recognize when the art was at least made with a sort of cohesive artistic vision, and choices were made for a reason. And this is the movie that Christopher Nolan wanted to make. And you can say it's a bad movie, but I don't think that we should be saying it's a wrong movie. Anyway, that's my tangent on art, and we see that it's not an uncommon perspective to have, but I have found with this movie that it is particularly omnipresent, this idea of I would have done it differently, or I would have liked to see a different interpretation, and therefore this interpretation is invalid in some way. Again, just to be very clear for the 10,000th time, that's not to say that you can't critique it, that's not to say that you can't say it's a piece of trash, or that the choices didn't work, but, yeah, just a little tangent on the discourse around this movie. Yeah, I won't linger on the Ithaca stuff because it just about sums it up to say that, I just didn't find it compelling. But the Odyssey stuff I thought overall was great. The Cyclops sequence was awesome. I thought it was very interesting and creepy how the Cyclops moved and reacted to them and just kind of ate them and went to sleep. In the movie he says, Odysseus I think says, would you talk to ants in your house? And that's really what it felt like. It felt like if I walked into my bedroom and there were a bunch of ants crawling around, and for some reason I just with the other ants running around. And that really was the vibe in the cave. Also, the sound design when they blinded the Cyclops was just, oh man, it was great. It was like really difficult to listen to and horrifying, and you just wanted it to stop. So, very well done. I liked that sequence, and I liked the design of the Cyclops. How its face, how its eye and nose kind of twisted. Its nose was twisting sideways, and then its eye was fully sideways. I thought it was pretty cool. I was a little less compelled by the, what are those guys called? The, like, giant cannibals. It's like a big, long L name, Laragingians or something. I can't remember, but anyway, I found that one kind of visually cool, but a bit, just a bit strange. You know, you have this baby in full armor, and then all of these guys in full armor, but where did they get this, like, perfect uniform plate mail type stuff? And you know, there's no sign of their civilization, their home, or anything like that. It was just woods. So I thought it was a cool sequence, but just didn't really click with me. Then you had Circe and the pigs, and that was awesome. It became like body horror for a bit there when she was turning them into pigs, but also even more horrifying than them being turned into pigs was them eating the food. The way that they were all like taken over by devouring these long strips of white, weird looking flesh, and they couldn't stop eating, and they were like crying and gorging on this food. It was really fucked up, but super cool. So I really enjoyed that sequence. Yeah, the sirens, kind of as expected. Scylla and Charybdis, kind of, what is it? Charybdis is the monster in the past, right? That was a kind of a cool, weird creature design. I liked the little hive that it had. The highlight of the Odyssey, one of them, was the like Hades part, where they see all their dead comrades and they talk to them. They talk to Sinon and Agamemnon and the dude who comes out of the ground. I really enjoyed that sequence and those conversations and that environment. Anyway, I'm just kind of rattling off the events now. But yeah, one part of the Odyssey home that I didn't care for so much was the bit where he's hanging out with I can't remember her name. The lotus flower woman who they fall in love. Anyway, what didn't work for me with it was I just didn't feel like there was any relationship there. We had like a little montage where you see them kind of seeming to fall in love. But, I don't know, he's been on that island for like 7 years, right? And I just didn't get that sense of history. And maybe the choice is you don't want the relationship to feel real because it's based on sort of entrapment and deceit, but I was kind of bored by that sequence because I think the two of them just didn't really have chemistry, and I was like, you two have been hanging out for 7 years. There's nothing going on between you two. Sorry, I'm swearing. I'm gonna wash my mouth out with soap. Yeah, but lots of cool stuff. Talking about the Zendaya of it all. So, you have Athena with Odysseus the whole time. And, the gods are present. They manifest in human form in the poems. And so, on the one hand, it's not weird to have Athena there. But what was weird is the movie is very grounded and realistic in a sense. There's monsters and whatever, but it's very earthy. And so Odysseus just having Athena with him felt a little out of place to me. It didn't really bother me, but once we got to the end and we saw that Zendaya was like a temple priestess who Odysseus watched get her head chopped off, it worked for me more, because then it opened a little bit of like, is this actually Athena, or is it Odysseus' trauma, or is it kind of both, right? And on that note, there's something at the beginning of the movie, at the very start, this text pops up on screen, and it reads, "In a time of apparent magic," which I think is very interesting and an important element in analyzing this movie and in what Nolan is doing, what he's interested in, because in a time of apparent magic means, well, you could interpret it, I guess, two ways. My reading of it was in a time of apparent magic, so apparent being a word which means seeming, right? And but kind of unconfirmed. On the other hand, apparent can mean, just visible. And sense can be sensed, right? So, I don't know, I guess maybe it's the second version, but when I read it, it struck me as having an air of skepticism or something. An air of, yes, there is apparent magic here, but almost the idea that if you dug deeper, things would actually be quite rational or scientific or whatever. And that struck me as very Nolan-esque, that he would take the Odyssey and try to confine it as much as possible into the realm of the human. And so in the Iliad, you've got gods popping out every 5 pages. But in Nolan's version, of course, things are, I really do believe, I think it was intentional that you could read this movie as Athena never actually being there. I think you could read this movie as the gods are not real. Now that might be a bit of a bold take, and I'm not sure I believe it myself, but I think it's a valid reading based on what we see. And on that note, maybe we should talk about kind of what I would consider the thesis of the movie, or one of the major Thesis, which is something like civilizations collapse from within, right? You lose what is valuable only after you sacrifice your own morality, your own sense of right and wrong. There's this whole thing in the movie about the law of Zeus. And it's this idea that anybody could be a god in disguise, and so you must shelter and help travelers and strangers and so on. And of course, Odysseus, with his plan of the Trojan horse to sneak into Troy and destroy the city, destroys this fundamental moral belief of their civilization. He annihilates it, and in so doing, he creates the Dark Age that is going to descend upon their society and destroy it. Because if you are unfamiliar with ancient Greek history, there's going to be something called the Bronze Age collapse, and Greece is going to kind of lose its, I'm not an expert on this stuff, but I guess it's sort of a small-scale monarch society, like these islands and communities of kings, or whatever you might call them, and things are going to dissolve into just sort of tribalism again, I suppose. Something like that. Anyway, the point is, after like a few hundred years, then Greece will start to rebuild again, and then eventually you get to the famous Greece, the famous classical Greece, right? With the Parthenon, and the point is, in Nolan's framing here, Odysseus and the army of Agamemnon destroy their culture because they destroy their own morality, right? They betray the moral code at the heart of their culture, and it causes their culture's downfall. Which I think, this movie, in some sense, you could read it as kind of a standard war is bad kind of message, and to some degree that is there. But I think it's doing a little more than that. I think it's saying more than just war, changes people, because their society, like, war is not uncommon in the past, and I don't think you're expected to believe that in the movie. I think what destroys their society, what destroys these people, is the fact that they used the Trojan horse to annihilate Troy. And then, of course, they become the sea people. It's this big reveal about, the sea peoples are these mysterious peoples in ancient history who kind of annihilated. I don't know why I'm laughing. They destroyed a bunch of civilizations and peoples in the ancient world. They attacked Egypt and Greece and so on. And what this movie does is you get this big twist where it's revealed Odysseus and Agamemnon and these returning soldiers from Troy were the sea people. So I didn't find all of that civilizational stuff to be super well implemented in the movie, but I thought it was a nice thing to have in there. It gave the movie a little more depth, zhuzhed it up a bit, made it a bit broader than just, here's the story of a guy trying to get home. So yeah, I mean, as always, could yap more about it, but I don't want to get too nitpicky and just, like, go scene by scene and talk about this or that. I'm trying to think if there's any... Okay, I'll hit one last negative thing, and I'll just be quick about it. The final Ithaca sequence, especially the fight, was really stupid. Just like every aspect of it was played out horribly. It didn't make any sense. I know that in the story Odysseus has to kill the suitors, but they really should have found a better way of justifying how that happens. Because, not to be too Reddit brained or whatever, or cinema sins and be like, oh, they only attacked him one at a time. But it was really hard to believe. There's 100 suitors in that room, and Odysseus has his bow and arrow, and that's the only weapon in the room, and he is so vastly outnumbered, and they all just run into the corners and wait to get shot. And then there's this 15-minute fight scene where Matt Damon is just beating the shit out of guys, and it's not believable. The fight choreography is okay, but it was really dark and hard to see, and Robert Pattinson is being goofy off on the side, and he's just shouting, grab the swords, grab the shields. I'm not going to go into the whole thing, but I thought it was a really terrible sequence, honestly quite bad. So, didn't really end the movie on a strong note, I suppose. But, yeah, so those are some of my thoughts on the Odyssey. If you watched it, if you have anything to say, feel free to leave a comment and I'll read it. But yeah, I thought not an earth-shattering movie, but enjoyable enough, and the kind of movie where I wouldn't be like, hey guys, let's get together on Friday night and watch the Odyssey. But if I'm back home and my mom's watching it on the TV and I'm walking through the living room, I would pop my ass down on the couch and watch for a bit. Thank you for joining me, my friends. Until next time, please take care of yourselves, and I will do the same. And remember to go subscribe to Growl ASMR.